What if everything you thought you knew about Africa's relationship with global powers was wrong? For decades, the narrative has been about aid and dependence, but a quiet revolution is underway. Discover how African nations are leveraging innovation, regional partnerships, and homegrown solutions to rewrite their own destinies and fundamentally shift the balance of power. For decades, the world has looked at Africa through a narrow lens, a place constantly in need of saving, dependent on foreign aid, and trapped in cycles of crisis. Western governments, global NGOs, and financial institutions built entire narratives around Africa's supposed weakness, projecting an image of a continent surviving only because outsiders kept pouring in billions of dollars. Yet behind this portrayal lies a much different reality, one that challenges everything the world thought it knew. The billions in aid money, though massive on paper, rarely translated into real transformation. Instead, it often reinforced dependency, creating systems where local potential was overshadowed by foreign control. This outdated view underestimated Africa's true power. Beneath the surface, countries across the continent were never waiting helplessly for handouts. They were building, innovating, and quietly rewriting their own destinies. The world's mistake was assuming that a continent with the youngest population on Earth, rich in resources and cultural dynamism, would remain permanently dependent. That assumption is now collapsing. The Africa of 2025 is no longer content with charity-driven models. It is stepping forward as a global player, one ready to compete on equal terms with the very powers that once dictated its future. The quiet revolution unfolding in Africa did not happen by accident. It is the result of bold internal shifts and the rise of leaders who refuse to accept the old status quo. Across the continent, innovation is replacing dependency, and local solutions are challenging the very structures that once held Africa back. From bustling tech hubs in Nairobi and Lagos to agricultural breakthroughs in Rwanda and Ghana, Africans are solving African problems with homegrown strategies. These aren't borrowed models. They are uniquely tailored to local realities, designed to create resilience instead of reliance. At the heart of this transformation is leadership with vision. A new wave of African presidents, policymakers, and entrepreneurs have shifted focus away from external approval and toward regional strength. Instead of competing in isolation, they are building alliances across borders through projects like the African Continental Free Trade Area, which aim to keep wealth circulating within the continent. This regional integration means that Africa is no longer just a collection of nations negotiating with powerful outsiders. It is increasingly presenting itself as one unified voice in global affairs. Driving this momentum is Africa's most valuable asset, its people. With nearly 60% of the population under the age of 25, Africa holds the world's youngest demographic. And this youth is not waiting around for opportunities to be handed to them. They are creating businesses, launching digital platforms, and rewriting the narrative of what it means to be African in the 21st century. From fintech entrepreneurs transforming banking systems to innovators tackling food security, the youth are both the energy and the architects of Africa's self-reliance. This combination of visionary leadership, regional cooperation, and an unstoppable generation of creators has planted the seeds of disruption, seeds that are now growing into something the rest of the world can no longer ignore. For decades, the global perception of Africa's economy was chained to its natural resources. Oil, gold, diamonds, and cocoa defined its role in the world market, while the real profits were siphoned off elsewhere. But that narrative is collapsing as African nations begin to prove they can thrive beyond raw exports. What's happening now is nothing short of an economic reinvention, one that positions Africa as a producer of ideas, technology, and culture, not just commodities. Look at Nigeria. While oil once dominated its economy, today it's Nollywood, the second largest film industry in the world, that's shaping Nigeria's global influence. This creative sector doesn't just entertain millions. It generates billions in revenue, creates jobs, and projects African culture onto the world stage. Kenya's story is equally transformative. With M-Pesa, a mobile banking innovation born in Nairobi, millions of people across Africa gained access to financial services for the first time. That single innovation didn't just change Kenya. It inspired a wave of fintech revolutions across developing nations worldwide. Ethiopia, too, has emerged as a manufacturing hub with industrial parks that attract global investors and create thousands of jobs, showing that Africa can compete in industries traditionally reserved for Asia. Another remarkable shift is how Africa is funding its own growth. Instead of depending entirely on Western loans or aid packages, African banks and investors are financing infrastructure, from roads and railways to energy projects, that tie the continent closer together. By relying more on internal capital, Africa reduces outside control and strengthens its independence. At the same time, trade partnerships are changing. Instead of looking only to Europe and the United States, African nations are building ties with Asian, Latin American, and Middle Eastern economies, diversifying their options and avoiding over-reliance on any single power. The message is clear. Africa is no longer waiting to be defined by outsiders. It is carving out its own identity as an economic powerhouse, led not just by resources, but by creativity, innovation, and strategic investments. The old dependency model is fading, and a new era, one where Africa competes on equal footing, is rapidly taking shape. When Africa begins to rewrite its own rules, the ripple effect doesn't just stay on the continent, it shakes the foundations of global power. For decades, the West operated with a sense of security, believing Africa would always remain a dependent partner, reliant on aid and dictated trade terms. But as Africa grows more self-reliant, Western capitals are suddenly scrambling to adjust. Washington, London, Paris, and Brussels now face a reality they never truly prepared for. An Africa that negotiates, dictates, and rejects one-sided deals. The United States and Europe are quietly rethinking their aid models. Instead of presenting themselves as saviors with strings-attached funding, they're trying to rebrand as partners. But the timing exposes their desperation. African leaders are no longer content with vague promises of development. They're demanding fair trade, technology transfer, and investment that builds industries at home. This reversal of roles has placed Western powers on unfamiliar ground, where they must prove their relevance in Africa rather than assume it. China, on the other hand, finds itself recalibrating. For years, Beijing's model was simple: build infrastructure in exchange for resource access. But as African nations impose new rules, like domestic processing requirements and stricter ownership laws, even China has had to adapt. Increasingly, Chinese companies are shifting from pure extraction to joint ventures and industrial partnerships, which align with Africa's push for value addition. In effect, Africa is reshaping China's playbook, not the other way around. This transformation has created a new balance of power. Africa is no longer a silent player on the global stage but a sought-after partner in negotiations. Global forums that once sidelined African voices are now witnessing African leaders setting the terms and influencing outcomes. From climate talks to trade deals, Africa's leverage is growing because the world realizes something vital. Without Africa's resources, markets, and youthful workforce, no global strategy is complete. For Western powers, it feels like an earthquake, an unsettling shift where their dominance is no longer guaranteed. For Africa, it feels like long overdue justice. The geopolitical map is redrawing itself, and Africa is finally moving from the margins to the center of global strategy. The story unfolding today is not just about economics or politics, it's about the birth of a new global reality. Africa, long portrayed as the continent of crisis and dependence, is now positioning itself as a central pillar of the future world order. Projections show that by 2050, Africa could become one of the top 5 global economic blocs, with its combined GDP rivaling traditional powers. With its vast resources, booming cities, and most importantly, a young and ambitious population, the continent is set to drive growth and innovation in ways the world can no longer ignore. But Africa's rise is not just measured in numbers, it's also cultural. From music and film to fashion and literature, African creativity is shaping global trends. What was once dismissed as local is now celebrated worldwide, turning African identity into a form of soft power that challenges outdated stereotypes. This cultural renaissance is building pride within Africa while also spreading its influence abroad, especially among diasporas who now see the continent as a source of strength, not struggle. The implications for the rest of the world are enormous. As Africa asserts its independence and demands fairness, global systems will have to adjust. No longer can deals be written in Washington or Brussels without African input. No longer will the continent serve as just a resource supplier while others reap the profits. Instead, Africa is emerging as a decisive voice in shaping a multipolar world, a world where power is shared, not dominated by a few. For the West, this is both a challenge and an opportunity. Resist the change and risk being left behind. Embrace it, and new partnerships based on equality and respect could emerge. For Africa, the journey ahead will not be without obstacles, but the trajectory is clear. The age of dependence is ending, and a new era of self-reliance and influence has begun.